really glad to be here, and I don't think I've ever given a talk where more of the audience is at home or being filmed, so please excuse if I seem a little awkward in that context. Just a couple things about myself before I get started. As Dr. Sager mentioned, animal ethics is one of the areas that I work in. I also work in environmental ethics a bit more broadly. And there are some potential conflicts between animal ethics and environmental ethics more broadly for reasons that I might discuss later on, or we can talk about in discussion. But tonight I'm really going to focus on questions of animal ethics. I did bring one thing for show and tell, but only because it just arrived in my mailbox today. It's this book called Animal Ethics and Philosophy, and in it, starting on page 165, one will find a paper that I co-authored with my colleague Angela Coventry about human animal ethics. So it's something that I myself am working on, and I'm kind of looking forward to checking out the book. Here that is. The topic of the talk today is basically just to give an overview of some of the main arguments with regard to our moral consideration of animals. And one thing I will say at the outset is that just about myself, I grew up in what's I think considered eating a standard American diet. So every dinner we would eat some kind of meat, and pretty much every breakfast and lunch as well we would at least have dairy products or other animal products. And upon seeing these arguments, arguments such as the ones that I'll be talking about today, they actually changed my mind about the morality of eating animals. And it took a couple of years, but the end result of the process is that I've actually completely changed my own eating practices on the basis of these arguments. So I come here as someone who, I will say up front, am a partisan in these debates. But I wasn't sort of born as a partisan in the debates. I actually was persuaded by these very arguments that I'm going to give you. So I think it's one area of philosophy where philosophical arguments really can have an effect on how we live our day-to-day lives. Certainly that's true of me, and I think these arguments in particular have had effects on millions of people. They started, Peter Singer, whom we'll discuss shortly, is known for having influenced many people starting in the 70s with his research on this topic. So I think it's an area where academic arguments by philosophers really have made their way into the public sphere. So that is all I'll say in preview. Now, before we get into the specific arguments about animal ethics, I did want to talk very briefly about environmental ethics. And so what I'd like you to do is the following exercise. It's an imaginative exercise, so you get to use your imagination. And it's to answer the following question. How do you want the world to be? And in saying that, I really want you to think big. I don't want you to say, I want the world to be such that there is more oversight on police activities. I want you to think like really, I mean, that's fine if you think that, but there's probably a reason for that. And the reason for that is maybe you want some equality amongst all people. So it's these bigger claims that I'd like you to entertain. And even more than that, I don't even want you to think about the human world. I want you to think maybe about the Earth in its entirety. So right now there's a lot of space which is oceans, there's a lot of space which we might call wilderness, and there's a lot of space that is filled with humans. And so I'd like you to think about how exactly you want the world to be, all in all. And I have a couple sub-questions just to help you think about this. So some things to consider. What should the total human population be? Should it be 7 billion, which is approximately what it is now, or should it be more or less? How long should people live? Is our current lifespan the ideal lifespan, or do you think that it would be better if we lived longer? And if so, then how would that affect population? Because if we live twice as long, then there'd be a lot more people. And probably then we'd occupy a lot more space on the planet. So think through that. Now, where should people live? In cities, suburbs, rural areas, or perhaps in tribes, such as pre-agricultural peoples? What's the ideal life for a person? Should humans be happy all the time, or should people go through their lives with periods of heartbreak or grief? What is your vision for the good human life? And some more things to consider. How should non-human animals be treated? Should there be domesticated animals? What should we eat? How much room should be left for wilderness? And what should wilderness be like? Should it be like it is today, like in early human times, like before human influence, or some other way? And should there be biodiversity? And also, should we try to inhabit other planets? So I ask you these questions to try to get you thinking about what you take to be of ultimate value, or the things that you really think are the most valuable all in all. Is it human well-being? Is it the well-being of all individual animals? Is it somehow, is the vision a more environmental vision, how there should be wilderness and areas left apart from human habitation? What I think this exercise does is just try to get you to think big, and even though it's kind of an impractical exercise because probably your vision of how the world should ideally be is unobtainable, at least on the basis of how things are now, it still, I think, will get you thinking about what steps should we take next, given the values that this exercise shows that you have. So I'd like to turn from that to specific questions about food and our use of animals. And I've actually stolen a few slides from a PowerPoint from another philosopher, Ramona Ilea, and Peter Spendolo, who is a biologist. And so I just wanted to show you a few slides which give some facts about our food consumption. So one question is how many animals are slaughtered every year in the U.S. And so we have this data here, and it might be a little hard to read, but I can tell you the data. This data, complete data, goes to 2013. You can ignore these two rows; these are only partial year figures. So this is the total number of animals slaughtered for food consumption in the U.S. in the billions. So 9.1 billion animals are slaughtered in the U.S. This, I believe, is cattle. This is chicken, ducks, pigs, and sheep and turkeys. And so that's the scale of our use of animals, and this does not include fish. So it's land animals that are used for human consumption, just in the U.S. Okay. Now, throughout the world, that 56 billion is how many land animals are killed every year in the whole Earth. And by 2050, farm animal production is expected to double. Right now, 30% of the Earth's land surface is directly or indirectly involved in livestock production. And factory farms are growing 2 to 6 times faster than traditional methods. And here are a couple pictures of conditions in factory farms. And here's a picture of egg production. If any of you saw Napoleon Dynamite when he goes into the egg, although you might be a little young for Napoleon Dynamite, but it showed a scene like this, where chickens who normally live in much more open conditions, this is how they live their whole lives in producing eggs. There are also environmental issues relating to our use of animals, and I'm not going to spend much time at all talking about these environmental issues. We could have a whole separate talk about climate change and the further effects of animal use. But I think I'm going to not talk about that because there's so much to talk about just on the issue our obligations to individual animals. There is actually one slide that I wanted to show you. It was the energy consumption used in producing a plastic bag versus a paper bag, and then what goes into a meat-based diet and a vegetarian diet. And so the title of, this is their slide, and it was what is in the bag is more important than the bag. This is when Portland was considering banning plastic bags. Okay, so let's talk about veganism and vegetarianism. So veganism may be defined as the practice of never consuming, purchasing, or using animal products. A common form of veganism is ethical veganism, where one is vegan because of ethical reasons. There might be other reasons to be vegan, such as health reasons, or if you don't like the taste of animal products. But what we'll be focusing on here is ethical veganism. There's also vegetarianism. And vegetarianism may be defined as the practice of never consuming or purchasing meat. And a common form of vegetarianism, likewise, ethical vegetarianism. So what we have here is a distinction between whether it's okay to eat some animal products but not meat, or whether we ought to not eat any animal products or use any animal products at all. So this relates to the issue of killing animals versus causing suffering to animals. So why should you be a vegan or vegetarian in the first place? And here, here are just some general reasons, and we'll dig a little deeper into the arguments shortly. So for some people, the idea is that it's always wrong to kill an animal, but for others, it's the fact that in raising animals for food or other use, the animal experiences suffering while alive. And so there's some disagreement on this question, and I probably won't talk too much about it, but I'm happy to answer questions in our discussion period about this particular issue. So for vegans, dairy is wrong because dairy cows are caused to suffer regardless of whether they're killed for human consumption or not. So what a big issue to think about is, insofar as our use of animals is objectionable, is it because of the suffering that is caused in their production, or is it because of the fact that they're killed at the end of the process? Now, probably the most famous person writing on these topics is the utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer, who is a professor at Princeton University. He's an Australian philosopher. He wrote the book Animal Liberation. Singer actually does think that humans are probably the most morally considerable species, given that we have really complex interests. So if you had a choice between saving a dog and saving a human, Singer would choose the human, but the idea is that we need to count each individual interest the same. So here's the utilitarian argument for veganism. Here's premise one. One should always act to minimize suffering and produce the most pleasure. And this is simply a statement of this view, utilitarianism. And I'm going to assume that you've encountered utilitarianism before, so I won't spend more time defining it. So that's premise one. Premise two, consuming or using animal products never minimizes suffering and never produces the most pleasure. So the conclusion is, therefore, one should never consume or use animal products. So this argument, I submit, is a valid argument, but we should dig a little deeper into the argument to see whether the premises are true. So first, let's look at premise two. Is it really true? And there is the issue first about what kinds of conditions do animals experience on farms. And I think I will show just a small bit of a video, which is actually, it's a claymation video. And one thing is that even though it's claymation, it can get, some of the images are disturbing. So if you're sensitive to disturbing images, then you may wish to not watch. And it was done by a 13-year-old. There is audio, and I know the audio isn't going to come out very well. So, so that is pretty much where bacon comes from. And so the premise of this argument, premise 2, says that consuming or using animal products never minimizes suffering and never produces the most pleasure. That the basis of that argument is the idea that animal products in their production produces a great deal of pain for animals. Now, according to the utilitarian, it also matters that you enjoy the taste of it. And so that should count for something. But according to the utilitarian argument, it doesn't outweigh the pain caused to pigs. So let's talk about some more concerns about that, though. So some cases of consuming animal products don't increase suffering, and some cases of consuming plant-based products do increase suffering. And also some medical testing may lead to more overall pleasure and less overall suffering if in using animals for the purpose of testing, if there are no other alternatives, you may cause a great deal of, you may relieve a great deal of suffering by doing so. So Singer, for instance, is not opposed to all uses of animals for medical reasons. And furthermore, some animals, such as bivalves and insects, may not experience suffering. Singer has actually gone back and forth. Most recently, he did say that it's probably okay to eat clams and oysters, but he was not definitive about that. But it depends on our best guess of the capacities of these animals to experience pain. So we might want to revise the utilitarian argument in the following way. So premise 1 stays the same. Premise 2 says consuming animal products almost never minimizes suffering and almost never produces the most pleasure. Therefore, one should never consume almost all animal products. But there may be some exceptions, and to determine whether it's permissible to consume an animal product on a particular occasion, determine whether doing so produces the most good. So just weigh how much pleasure you get from it, and weigh all the other consequences of it, and then subtract out the amount of pain that's caused on the other end. Okay, I'm going to actually skip this slide. But there are now some concerns one might raise about utilitarianism more generally. So concerns against premise 1 of the argument. So some people view utilitarianism as problematic because it accepts the idea that the ends always justify the means. So for instance, utilitarians may hold that in some cases, torture is morally permissible. Actually, this was just an issue that came out in the last couple of days because of the release of the Senate report about U.S. interrogation techniques during the time of the Second Gulf War. And I did see one study there that said that about 30% of Americans think that torture is never, ever justified. Another, about 20%, believe that it's very rarely justified. 30% think that it's sometimes justified, and 20% think that it's often justified. I don't know actually, I didn't look into the details of the study, but at least a significant portion of people think that it's rarely or never justified. But for the utilitarian, and this is something for all of you to think about, whether you believe that sometimes, or whether in cases of torture, the ends can justify the means. If you can get information that will prevent something really bad from happening, then would that make torturing somebody morally permissible? Okay, now the main alternative to the utilitarian position, at least within the philosophical literature, is that given by Tom Regan. And there is Tom Regan. And he wrote a book that came out, I think it was the late 70s, might have been early 80s, called The Case for Animal Rights. And what Regan argues for is equal rights for individuals who meet a condition of what he calls to be a subject of a life. And just to sum up what that means, so individuals who are conscious and who value their own lives, who have some sense of their own future, count as subjects of a life. And this includes basically all the animals that are usually eaten, hunted, and used in animal testing and entertainment. And so for Regan, the subject of any subject of a life should not be used as a means to an end. So Regan's view has its heritage in Kantian philosophy, and I won't say more about that, but perhaps you've talked about Kant's views before. So here's a quote from Regan. Non-human animals want and prefer things, believe and feel things, recall and expect things. In all these dimensions of our life, including our pleasures and pain, our enjoyment and suffering, our satisfaction and frustration, our continued existence or our untimely death, all make a difference to the quality of our life as lived, as experienced by us as individuals. As the same is true of animals, they too must be viewed as the experiencing subjects of a life with inherent value of their own. So, so Regan criticizes utilitarianism, even though Regan's view is actually similar, at least to Singer's, in that Regan thinks that we should be vegans. So here's his critique of utilitarianism. So he writes that utilitarianism is an aggregative theory, so different individual satisfactions or frustrations are added or summed or totaled. And so that's the start of his objection. So again, as a reminder, for the utilitarian, you do weigh in the pleasure that you might get from eating meat, and then the pain that eating meat causes, and then you do the calculation, and you add it together, and for the utilitarian, it typically comes out that you shouldn't eat meat. But Regan thinks that that kind of procedure is wrong. That anytime you violate the rights of a subject of a life, it's wrong, even if you do get pleasure from it. So, so he gives this example of his Aunt Bee, and I won't go through all the details he gives it, but the idea is that by murdering Aunt Bee, he could take her money and use some of it for himself, but also give it to a children's hospital where the hospital would benefit and kids would benefit. And is it morally appropriate in such an instance to kill Aunt Bee? And Regan thinks that the answer is obviously not. That Aunt Bee has a right to her own continued existence, even if the consequences of killing her would benefit more people. So this is a specific example that Regan gives to say that we shouldn't just be adding and subtracting goods, that there are specific moral rules that prohibit murdering someone who has a right to her or his own continued existence. So, so that's why Regan isn't a utilitarian. I'll only say one quick thing about this. One thing that Regan brings together in this argument is he brings together two potential different objections to utilitarianism. The first is that on utilitarianism, we don't have any special obligations to our own loved ones. So this example that he gives is an example of his own aunt. And so you might say that that's going to be a problem because we do have special obligations to our own relatives or loved ones or those who are close to us. But another way this objection could have gone is if it wasn't Aunt Bee, but it was just someone out there, some stranger who was wealthy who you could still kill. And I think the objection could still go through as an objection to utilitarianism, even if it was a stranger. So one thing in thinking about this kind of example is to think about how much force the fact that it's his aunt takes, as opposed to just that it's any person. And the reason why I mention this is that there's some versions of views like utilitarianism that accept that we can weigh the well-being of our loved ones more than those of strangers. So those versions of utilitarianism might be able to avoid the full concern that Regan is expressing here. But there's still, I think, even if you accept that view, this underlying concern that it would be wrong to kill a stranger for these purposes. So Regan rejects utilitarianism on that. And I will also say that this form of objection to utilitarianism is a very classic form of objection. And there are responses from utilitarians, and there's a rich debate ongoing about this kind of objection. So it's a big issue. Okay, I'll skip the contractarianism part, but that is in the paper that we distributed. Anyway, so Regan's argument for veganism, at least this is my way of phrasing it. Premise one should, whoops, and there's a typo in there, one should never violate the rights of a subject of a life. Second, consuming or using animal products violates animals' rights. Third, animals which are used for food and other uses are subjects of a life. So if you combine 2 and 3 together, what that means is that consuming or using animal products violates the rights of subjects of a life. But premise 1 says that you should never violate the rights of a subject of a life. So Regan's conclusion is you should never consume or use animal products. And I actually once had dinner with Tom Regan, and I was still a grad student, but one of the other people, he had given a talk, and a few of us were invited to go out to dinner with him. And he did eat the all-vegan meal, so one of my fellow dining companions asked him the following question. The question was, if there was a person who needed a liver transplant, and unfortunately there was no human match to get a liver transplant, and the person was about to die. But there was a squirrel out there, and by transplanting the liver from the squirrel to the person, you could save the person's life. Would that be acceptable? And here's Regan's answer. He said, well, first of all, was the squirrel like attacking the person and chewing on his liver? Is that the concern? And no, that wasn't the issue. It was just a squirrel minding its own business. And Regan's answer was, well, if the squirrel is minding its own business, it has a right to its own existence. And so it would be wrong to then kill the squirrel for the purpose of saving a human life. So I think this example definitely does kind of get us thinking about whether the kind of approach that Regan recommends, which is the rights-based approach, which says that there's this blanket moral prohibition on always prohibiting uses of animals or anyone for someone else's good. That's Regan's view. Versus the utilitarian view, utilitarian would be like, well, how much more life would the squirrel have, and how much more life would the person have? How many interests would be fulfilled one way or the other? And so presumably the utilitarian would vote against the squirrel. It would be thumbs down to the squirrel in this instance. So that's also something to think about as you think about both the Ant B example. And the Ant B example, certainly intuitively, we seem to favor the idea that there is some kind of blanket prohibition. And in the squirrel case, we seem to think that even if you do think that squirrels are morally considerable, even if you think that we shouldn't just, it would be wrong to go out of our way to harm a squirrel for no reason, it seems to push in the direction of the aggregative approach. So it's just something else for you to think about. Now, here are some concerns for Regan's argument. So one question, is it even possible to never use or harm animals? So even vegetable farming typically clears space otherwise occupied by animals, and pesticides kill animals. Even organic produce uses organic pesticides. So animals are typically involved in and harmed in almost every human activity. And so that would seem to be something where basically every activity is wrong. Now you might say that animal farming, to raise food for animals, you have to use a lot of space and clear a lot of space to give the feed for the animals, and that's true. And that's another reason I think why people, for environmental reasons, say it's better to go vegetarian because it uses less land. So you do kill fewer animals by not raising food to feed to larger animals. But still, if what we're talking about is a blanket prohibition against killing, then it would seem like Regan's view would have a hard time even with vegan vegetable production. And I guess the broader issue is to ask, well, what's most important? To have your own hands be clean, so never yourself causing an animal's rights to be violated, or acting in such a way that the fewest individuals suffer. Now, Regan does have responses to these questions, but there's definitely things for you to think about as you think about these issues. Now, I'd like to turn to a few responses that people often give to arguments for and against veganism and vegetarianism. So the first thing that often comes up is the question of humanely raised animals. So are animals which are raised humanely, morally acceptable? Now, Regan would say no, because using them for our own purposes is always wrong. So if you're going to kill the animal at the end of the day, even if the animal lived a good life, that would still be wrong. So Regan would say, I wouldn't eat my dog after it had a good long life, and so you shouldn't eat other animals after they've lived, even if you've given them good long lives. Now, utilitarians would be open to the possibility that such animal products are morally acceptable. As it turns out, Peter Singer has actually written somewhat extensively on this issue, and he argues that in at least most instances of what are called humanely raised meat, those are still unacceptable. So just a couple notes. There are no USDA-approved humane labels. So just because a product says it's humanely raised doesn't necessarily mean that it has been humanely raised. So if this is something you are interested in, I really do encourage you to look into the details of any product that says that it's humanely raised. And second, and this is what Singer claims in his book, that most instances of humane treatment still involve a lot of suffering to animals. So in bringing animals to slaughter in particular, that causes a great deal of suffering, even for animals who've lived their lives in more ways suitable to their nature. Let's see. A second objection goes along following on, but eating meat is natural. And if you make this objection, there are a couple responses that you should be prepared to respond back to. So, so one might object that eating meat is natural and therefore morally acceptable. However, you need to answer the following question. So first question, what is it to be natural? And this is actually one of the biggest questions in all of philosophy. What counts as something's being natural? Do some actions being natural mean that they are appropriate? So, for instance, males forcing females to have sexual intercourse is common in the animal kingdom, but does that make it right for humans? So just because something is seemingly natural, why does that make it morally acceptable? And third, is our current method of industrial meat production natural? Is raising pigs in the way depicted in that video, is that somehow much more natural than, say, just eating vegetables? And furthermore, perhaps along these lines, is anything that we do natural? Is sitting in a room without any natural light, using a clicker, talking about philosophy? I mean, how natural is that? Now, you might say, oh, well, it's wrong then to do these things, and we should all be out foraging, etc. And, I think that there's something to be said for that answer, but just keep in mind that if you're going to make this objection about meat consumption, that you should also be prepared to follow the objection to other areas of our lives. I'll conclude with just a couple more tricky questions that vegans sometimes get. So what about sponges? My wife brought home a sponge. It was an actual sponge. It wasn't, a synthetic sponge. It was, and as you probably know, sponges are animals. And I was like, don't you know I'm vegan? And she was like puzzled. She didn't know what to say. And I was like, I'm just kidding. Because, what makes the difference between animals and plants? Well, it has to do with the way that they process energy and the structure of the cell walls. It turns out sponges, even though they don't have a nervous system, count as animals. It also has to do with the lineage. What I think most people would want to do is define veganism in terms of our obligations to sentient animals who can experience pain or pleasure. And so sponges are okay. Now, of course, there might be environmental consequences of real sponges versus synthetic sponges, and I don't know actually which way that issue goes. But this is probably a better version of veganism. It's just kind of convenient to say that we ought to not eat animals or not consume animals because animalhood overlaps pretty closely with sentienthood, but it doesn't actually map up precisely. So what about animals for whom it's unclear whether they're sentient? There are a couple different responses. First is to give them the benefit of the doubt. That's what Singer says in his interview with Colbert. Or maybe we can figure out how likely it is that they're sentient and act accordingly. Now, there was an article that circulated. It was a study in Australia which claimed that bushmeat causes less harm to animals in vegetable farming. Because in vegetable farming, you have to, in Australia apparently they have these mouse blights, and so in certain years you have to kill a lot of mice in order to raise vegetables. And you don't have to do so if you went out into the bush and killed, say, a kangaroo. And so this article claimed that vegans ought to be killing kangaroos so that they wouldn't be killing mice in farming. I'm not sure what Regan would say in this case. Yeah, I just don't know. If I could have dinner with him again, I would probably ask him this question. I don't know if there would be kangaroo on the menu, but I would still ask him. Now, the utilitarian, or the welfarist, might say either that it's okay to consume the bushmeat, or maybe you shouldn't eat it all, or you should hold off until you're in a place where there are better options. So that would be that. Now, what about wild-caught fish? Wild fish are going to die painful deaths even if they're not killed by a human. The same may be said for deer hunting. Now, Regan, I think it's pretty clear, would say it's still wrong to catch fish since this violates the right to life. The utilitarian might say either it's wrong to deprive the fish valuable years of its life, so there would still be some harm caused in killing fish, or deer. Or the utilitarian might say it depends on the fish and the environment. If it's a predator, it may even be best to catch the fish, because if you kill a predator and then more other animals live, and if those other fish live happy lives, then you might have done a utilitarian good by killing the predator. Of course, you have to be concerned about ecosystemic collapse, so you need to be careful if you start doing this sort of stuff. But there are some utilitarians who are really looking into this kind of question. I'm not sure what the ultimate answer is going to be, but they're looking into it. Now, if the fish is near the end of its life anyway, and catching it won't cause increased suffering or environmental damage, then it may be best to catch it. So the utilitarian doesn't accept a blanket prohibition. What about eggs from chickens who are treated humanely? Again, Regan's response would be it's still wrong to do. And the utilitarian or welfarist response would say that such practices still cause chicks and chickens to suffer, so one should avoid them. Or maybe it's permissible to eat such eggs. One thing is that in egg production for laying hens, like in people's backyards, there are, for every laying hen, there's pretty much a male that's born, but those male chicks aren't of any use to anybody. All that really matter are the females, because the type of animal, the type of chickens that are used for egg production are no good for meat production. And so basically they kill the males at a very young age. So even chickens who are used for ordinary backyard egg production still causes small male chicks to be killed. So I know some utilitarians say for that reason it's wrong to consume eggs, even eggs from backyard chickens. What about in vitro meat? You might have heard that there is research now done in creating artificial meat products. Singer actively supports in vitro meat since it would lead to less animal suffering. Gary Francione, who is another animal rights advocate, says that in vitro meat is problematic as a symbolic manner. And actually, I think I'll say that. I'll leave the rest for later. The last thing I'll just say is that the notion of being vegan is typically a notion which is binary. Either you're vegan or you're non-vegan. And there's another notion of a scalar concept, which admits degrees or shades of gray. I must say I wrote this up before 50 Shades of Gray became a thing, so I will probably in the future change my wording there. Anyway, so maybe we should have another term which is a scalar term. So maybe like veg, so you can ask, how veg are you? So rather than non-vegan saying, I'm not a vegetarian or vegan, so I'm just going to eat anything I want, since I'm now a carnivore or an omnivore, they might just say, I've decided to not be completely veg. So I think the utilitarian in me thinks that this is a good idea to change our language so that even if it won't lead to more people being absolutist about being vegans or vegetarians, it might still reduce animal suffering. And I think I'll leave it at that. It's probably a good time, to take questions, and happy to hear your thoughts and discussion. Yeah.